and welcome to a session on architecting your startup stack. My name is Andrew Harvey, and I'm just going to give us a quick run through about the session, get us acquainted, and hopefully run into some of your questions soon. Just in terms of an agenda, it's really pretty simple. We're going to do a little rundown about what to expect. I'm going to introduce myself and my colleague Damola, and then we're going to have some open question and answer time. And love to hear some questions from you. How to do that? Well, use the Q&A box. So you should be able to find up in the Teams menu a Q&A box, and you can enter your questions in there. We will go through those, we'll moderate them, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can in as much depth as we can in the half hour or so that we have. And so the questions are going to appear to you, to everyone once they've been approved, so you can see what's coming up, and we're going to answer them where we can verbally, so that we can all save this recording and you can come back and watch it again if you want to. As I said, this session will be recorded, and we have some great folks who are helping moderate for us. Help them out too. Don't spam the Q&A. Just one or two questions. And if there's a lot of questions, maybe think about whether it's already been asked before. And we also ask you to please adhere to the Microsoft Code of Conduct. You'll see that as an announcement in the Q&A already, but here it is here, just for you to have a look at. It's our aim that this is a really helpful and engaging session, and so we need you to bring your best self to that as well. And please uphold these codes of conduct. If you feel like the code of conduct hasn't been upheld, you can then there's some contact details for you there. These details are all also in the Q&A for you. So yes. Now, what can you ask us about? Hopefully, maybe you've seen the architecting your startup stack on-demand session. If not, I highly recommend you check it out. Just search for startup or architecting your startup in the My Build tool. But we are here, Dee and I are here to answer your questions about architecture choices for startups of all stages. Both of us have worked in startups at various stages. Both of us have worked with startups across many stages. And so we're really here to answer those questions. We're here to talk about some of the Microsoft technologies that can support your architecture, and also about how you go through kind of matching your architecture with your business. And so we'd really love to see your questions in the Q&A. But before we do that, because we understand there is like a 20-second delay between you typing something and it kind of reaching us and going back and forth. So while you do that, go ahead and think of your questions and type them in now. I'm going to introduce myself and also bring in Dee. My name's Andrew Harvey. As I said, I'm a startup advocate. I am a former startup CTO, having been a CTO in a health tech startup and a fitness startup. I have experience as a developer as well. My background is first as a developer and an architect, and then moving into that CTO role. And now at Microsoft, I get to help startups at scale. And so I work on our programs to really help every one of you succeed. And I want to bring in Dee, Damola. How are you doing this morning?
Doing good. Glad to meet folks. Hi, my name is Damola, or D for short. CTO in residence with startups. I'm a serial entrepreneur myself, also an engineering strategist, as I like to say. I've been spending the last 12 or so years building things, both in the enterprise and personally for some of my own ventures. So 4-time CTO, also engineering lead for many startups that have either been through 500 startups, TechCrunch, Disrupt, you name it. So really looking forward to meeting folks and answering questions and really talking about architecture.
Great. Well, Dee, we've got our first question already, which I really appreciate. Thank you, Derek. Derek asks us, how can the tech stack minimize technical debt and protect the software supply chain? And I think this is a great question. Like, tech debt is something that we are often kind of very aware of, especially as you start growing your startup, that you tend to have accrued technical debt, and architecture is a place where that can really be somewhere where it can kind of accrue, where you make architectural choices early on and then potentially regret that as you grow. Do you have some perspective on this, on how we take a tech stack and kind of set it out in a way that is going to avoid accruing that technical debt?
Absolutely. I think going back to really just the recommendations, there's going to be various stages of a startup. So the explore, expand, and the extract phase. And in that early lifespan or lifestyle of the startup, you're probably optimizing more for speed. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't make great choices that will reduce your technical debt, but usually when the startup is new, the idea is new, it's more important to build in the ability to be flexible with your architecture and with your technology. So when the startup's early, I recommend optimizing for speed, but as you start to grow and mature, you're going to want to optimize for growth and scale that's eventually going to come. So sometimes what you'll see in that stage is you're starting to use more advanced concepts. Let's say that you didn't start off with containers, maybe you started off deploying to a VM, now you're moving into containerization, maybe your team is growing. So what we really recommend is that the architecture expand with the startup. Now, when you talk about the software supply chain, it's so important during that architectural phase to think about security, to think about different penetration points. And one of the things that I advocate for, and we advocate for, and is really thinking about security sooner rather than later. And you can do that in various ways. But when it comes to the software supply chain, it's important to think about what that DevOps process looks like, specifically your security DevOps stance and your process for actually getting code from machine to the cloud. You're thinking about things like making sure secrets aren't stored in GitHub, all of those things that would normally be an issue if you're not careful to plan for them. So really the way that you do your architecture, the stage that your startup's in, all of those things ideally would coalesce, and you're going to be growing your maturity as you progress upon that lifestyle or life cycle. Any thoughts, Andrew?
Look, I think I really echo what you've said. There's some great perspectives in there. I guess for me, like there's a couple of things that really spring to mind, and one of them is like, it reminds me of my earliest self in one of the startups that I kind of built an architecture for. Was what I kind of embraced was what I describe now as hipster driven development, and it's really tempting sometimes to pick a whole bunch of shiny things and really interesting things to get to play with. And I think that temptation, especially if you're going from having been like an individual contributor, like a kind of pretty a developer on a team, where you've felt constrained by all the choices that have been put upon you, and now you're kind of starting to build out your startup stack. The temptation is like, I want to use that piece of shiny, and I want to use that piece of shiny. And I did that. Like, I had stuff that was like pre V1 technologies. So key value stores and all sorts of things. And the amount of stress that caused was just huge, and it made those inflection points more difficult than they needed to be. Whereas if I had have chosen a kind of tried and true technology in some of those slots, I think one of the pieces of shiny that I actually chose was Elasticsearch, and that is a technology that has now withstood the test of time, but it was pretty rough and ready at the time, and so it accrued a bunch of technical debt for us. So we had and those are decisions you then have to unwind. And so I think there's a temptation in that early stage to perhaps to gravitate to those things. I think the other thing that you mentioned in terms of supply chain is another really is a fantastic thing. And again, those tried and true technologies, those well-supported technologies, that doesn't mean they have to be paid technologies. Like, I'm a big advocate for open source. I love databases like Postgres. I love all sorts of things, but looking at those and looking at the level of engagement that's going on in those projects. And then for your tech stack, in terms of if you're using open source packages, like if you're pulling in packages using NuGet or NPM or Ruby Gems or pip or whatever it is, if you're pulling in packages, you should be using either like hopefully at least the free kind of dependency management tasks inside your continuous integration. But that's like those third-party dependencies are part of your software stack. They're part of your architecture. And so you should be very aggressively checking them. So use Dependabot on GitHub. Make sure you're keeping on top of those things, because I mean, and sometimes it's difficult when you have like a deep dependency graph and it becomes a chore, but actually prioritizing those chores, even in the midst of like the kind of wanting to get features out the door, is super important. So thanks a lot for that question, Derek. Hopefully that's an answer that's useful for you. We have a question about the key design differences between enterprise scale and startup architectures. This one's an interesting one. Dee, you've kind of had experience on both sides of the fence there, having done some enterprise architecture. What do you see as the key differences?
So I think it really goes back to the speed at which software moves. One of the things that I would say, and this has changed over the years, but when I was in enterprise, right, it seemed like they would follow more of a traditional waterfall model. Things would be kind of drawn out a little bit more, thought through in terms of architecture, that kind of thing, and also would leverage things that really kind of accentuated security as well as stability and reliability, just because in the enterprise, downtime is a huge cost to the enterprise. And then the other thing I would say that you would see a lot of time within enterprise is that a lot of software was built for the business, specifically looking to either reduce costs, increase velocity, or increase revenue. Now, what I would say is a little bit different when it comes to startup architectures is that, once again, in the early stages, it's really about getting to that MVP or proof of concept. And once you get to that stage, then let's say that your startup is your business or the software or the tools that you're building gain a lot of notoriety, then it's usually about making sure that it can scale and support the needs of the users. I think that in the early lifestyle, you're going to be spending a lot of time just figuring out what works, right? Whereas with enterprise projects, they tend to be a bit more concrete and thought out in terms of their architecture and where they'll be deployed, that kind of thing. I would say one thing that's changed and that is in common between the two is really just this desire and this need to move to the cloud, right? I think back in the day, a lot of enterprise was either on-prem or some of the companies that I worked for had their own data centers. But what we've seen is definitely more of a migration to the cloud native, and then leveraging the best of containerization and some of the other technologies since then. I would say one more thing about the enterprise versus, say, startup architectures is they tend to be more risk adverse. Specifically, we talked a little bit about versioning and the type of really kind of packages that you want to use in the enterprise. Since you're optimizing for stability, you're going to be a little bit more specific when you select a node package or when you evaluate a technology, where with startups, usually you have a little bit more freedom and flexibility to experiment and try new things. So those are some of the thoughts that come to mind when I reflect on my experience in the enterprise versus building startups.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that I would suggest that there shouldn't be a huge difference between enterprise scale and startup, but I think again it comes to those stages of what you're optimizing for. In economics, there's this thing of like convex opportunities versus concave opportunities, and convex opportunities is where the cost of something not panning out is very low, and so you don't want to invest a huge amount until you know it's going to kind of uptick. It's going to do that hockey stick, which is exactly where the world that we live in startups. Whereas if you're in an enterprise position where it's an incumbent position, you're a lot more defensive because the cost of failure, the stakes are so much higher, and so your cost sensitivity is lower in the enterprise, like your ability to just spend a whole lot of money. So I mean, the example that I think of is like if I was choosing an app platform, like for a startup that is starting out, that is trying to work things out, the kind of shared tiers, the standard tiers, and even the basic tiers of app service are perfectly acceptable. They will get the job done. They will get you started quickly. It's a great service. However, if you're in the enterprise, you are going to be looking at app service environments, which, because of its isolation, because of its all of the things, the great features that you get with it, those are enterprise scale features, but they come with an enterprise scale price tag. And you have to make that choice about whether that's the right choice for where you are in this business. There are some startups, like in highly regulated industries, like if you're doing some, I know of a couple of fintechs that I've worked with that have gone straight for app service environments because that is the high regulatory environment they've been in. So they've made that choice, and their architecture has looked a lot more enterprise scale from day zero, but in a really digital native kind of way. And so I think in the best instances, it's about choosing the right path through that. I think a lot of enterprises could potentially choose a less expensive SKU for things, but they don't, because they have that cost sensitivity isn't there, and then that saves them a step change if they do have to change. So I think the the short answer is hopefully not too much difference. I see a lot of startup architectures. I'm like, I wish some enterprise architectures looked more like this, because they are lean, they do what they have to, and they don't overburden themselves. At the same time, I see startup architectures like, you're going to need a little bit more than this. You need to think sometimes maybe a little bit more about resilience. You need to think a little bit more about isolation. So the short answer is, like, there shouldn't be that much difference. The reality is there is a significant difference in these architectures, and some of it just comes down to team. The team size and scale and the number of people that you have to throw at the problem is different, and so that changes. Also, the stability of the domain. In a startup, you are subject to all sorts of business pivots, and if your architecture has insufficient flexibility, you're going to be in trouble. And so I think that's where a lot of enterprise scale architectures, they have a lower level of flexibility because they don't need it. They can be really down a certain path, whereas I wouldn't suggest a startup runs down a service-oriented architecture or like microservices early on, because you haven't actually got a solid enough idea of where the bounded contexts are in your domain. And so you're going to build the wrong services or the wrong service boundaries, and you're going to have to rewrite that. Whereas in an enterprise scale, like, hopefully in that business is mature enough that those contextual boundaries are a lot more clear. Okay.
There's a question we missed earlier in the thread. The question was, yeah, I started a new project with .NET Core MVC 1.0 a few years ago. I want to modernize that project. What should I start with to redo the project?
I think that's a question for you.
Definitely move from 1.0. There's several reasons to do that. Biggest being just security and speed. We've made leaps and bounds of improvements in terms of .NET Core and the technology. And when it comes to really kind of modernizing and moving from an existing project, it depends on how much code you are working with. Specifically, what I recommend is, if it's possible, because a lot of the libraries really kind of translate and transfer, to copy and paste the actual code from the existing base into a new project template in either Visual Studio or from the .NET Core CLI. But it really depends on what other dependencies you may have. What I find is NuGet usually does a really good job of restoring those dependencies, and then with a little bit of work, you can actually get a 1.0 project working in 6.0, or I think we're at 6 now, right? .NET 6 Core, and that would be probably my recommendation for anyone, and that goes across any of the versions prior to 6.
Yeah, I throw that question to D because my experience is much more with open source languages like Ruby and Python and other languages like that, where my .NET is less strong, shall we say. We have another question. This is going to hopefully be a quick answer as well. DV says, I am planning for a tech startup. What are the resources available from Microsoft for a tech startup in the Azure cloud? And moderator Ted, and shout out to Ted. Thank you so much for moderating and hanging with Dee and I. He's already replied in the Q&A, but I wanted to kind of verbally answer this as well. If you're interested in, if you've got a startup and you're interested, you should absolutely check out startups.microsoft.com. You should check out Microsoft Founders Hub, because there is a slew of resources for whatever stage your startup is at. And those resources include some recommendations, some tech advice, as well as a bunch of benefits, including Azure credits, which scale with you from whether you're you literally have an idea and a business name through to a funded, VC funded scaling startup. There's credits there for you. There's mentoring. There are other kind of third-party benefits that we're bringing in. So it's a fantastic resource. Startups.microsoft.com. Go and check it out. Now we have a question from Eric. Eric asks, for small teams in the expand stage, how do you balance between working on the actual product and researching or learning or testing different architecture options? This is a great question, Eric. I mean, great job having a small team still in the expand stage, because that's sometimes where the team size starts to balloon out. I think it's a really interesting balance to strike, especially at that stage, and it depends on how much is on fire. If your current architecture is relatively stable and isn't a point of contention, there may be other problems that are more important for you to be solving right now. However, I think it is important to kind of stay ahead of that as well, especially from a services point of view. And there is a potential benefit in thinking about sketching out those contextual boundaries that you might think about for services, microservices, if you're not already in that space, because that tends to be a significant point of kind of scaling contention, that you tend to have these mismatched services where one area of your domain tends to have high transaction velocity, high transaction volume, and other parts just don't. And hopefully you can separate those things out. Like to borrow from e-commerce. Now, not every architecture looks like an e-commerce architecture, but you tend to have in e-commerce a high transactional volume around your searching and browsing, which is good because you can generally use a high level of caching around those parts of the architecture, whereas your transactional part of the services, your commerce service, tends to have a much lower transactional volume, but also a much slower standard transaction, because you are calling out to third-party payment processors and all of those kind of things. You're doing your fraud checks. And so the way that you approach those services is different. And if you can decouple them, that means you can scale them separately. You can scale your that kind of front-end web tier much more aggressively, and sometimes have a higher release cadence on that compared to your commerce service, which has a lot lower tolerance for failure. So that's starting to think ahead to those service boundaries. I think it's very important that you engage with that without committing too much time, because really, if you're in that expand stage, you're on a rocket, and everything can feel very chaotic. So I think dedicating some time just to even assess the architecture. One of the other things that you want to do is that you're not making decisions on the run. So I would highly recommend taking deliberate time to make those choices. Is there any kind of thoughts that you have there, Dee, on how a small team kind of strikes that balance for kind of maturing their architecture?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's honestly what you said. You kind of learn as you go, and hopefully at this stage, because the team is so small, lines don't get crossed. You're able to actually maybe split the team, have some folks working on future or really just different versions of the design of the software system or the architecture, and really report back before integrating in. I think what's really nice about where we've come as an industry, and really just what we're seeing with regards to the dev tools, DevOps and deployments, being able to do blue-green deployments, for example, and some of the tooling that's enabled through Azure, is the ability to experiment and really kind of try things without necessarily bringing down the entire system. So yeah, I think overall within this stage, some of it is a business decision. I think that for me, for example, with some of my startups, some of my businesses, I balance investor request or what they think would work as a product with what I need or what I know needs to be prioritized. So it's a balance that you have to strike, and as you grow your team, it's something that I think that you'll be able to kind of work amongst yourselves, and eventually maybe you'll get to the point where half your team is maybe, or a percentage of your team is looking into R&D, and others are just kind of keeping the business running. So
Yeah.
One question. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. You sound like you got a question to take us to.
Yeah, so this one is really interesting, and it's anonymous, but there seems to be a mix of secret handling methods: Azure Key Store, secure environment variables, GitHub secrets. What is the balance to keep things fluid and still have a manageable deployment process? There doesn't seem to be a lot of example level resources on how to move something from my desktop into a reasonable production deployment. Great question. Thoughts on that?
And yeah, this one's a really interesting one. And that move from like something on your desktop to like a reasonable production deployment is significant. Like so I would suggest you want to make choices that and I talk about this in the on-demand session, is you want to make choices that kind of give yourself options and don't kind of close you in. And so of those three choices that you've given, like secure environment variables and GitHub secrets can get you going very fast. I think GitHub secrets have a limitation in that you don't really want a tight coupling between your CI/CD environment and your deployment. So kind of for that application deployment, I would say only have in GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps, but only have in that CI environment what you absolutely have to build an artifact, which then should know as little as possible. That if that artifact is compromised, there's no secrets embedded in that. So that would be my first thing. You should have enough secrets. For me, when I've got build pipelines, generally those secrets tend to be really limited to maybe a service principal, so that I can access Azure resources. Although now with federated identity between GitHub Actions and Azure, that's going to go away, which makes me very excited. But that should be the extent of the secrets in your GitHub. Now, between secure environment variables and Azure Key Store or Azure Key Vault, my tendency is to tend towards Key Vault because that gives you less kind of lock-in, if that makes sense. What I have experimented with is using ways to kind of get past having to have Azure Key Vault as a dependency. If you're using a language which has a first party, like a fully supported Azure SDK, then Key Vault is a really easy choice to make. So if you're using .NET or JavaScript or Python, it's a really easy choice to make a choice to use Azure Key Store or Key Vault, because you can use those libraries as part of your application, and it works really well. I have also found a technique that has worked well for me, where I have a kind of a co-process or that grabs the secrets for me. The other thing that you can look into is also looking at using Dapr, DAPR. If you're using in a containerized environment, I suggest checking out Dapr specifically, and also checking out Azure Container Apps. But that allows you to expose environment variables in a very easy way to your application without having to think about all of the kind of implications of that. So I really like Dapr as a technology for that. Again, your mileage may vary, but looking for that optionality of being able to change easily is really important. So migrating your secrets, for example, if you decide to move, you've started on app service and then you've decided to move to container apps, that can be like a little bit of a nasty process of extracting all of those secrets and moving them across. It's not impossible, but it's just another chore to do. Whereas if you have all your secrets already in Key Vault and it's just about changing where your application is hosted, that can be easier. So I kind of suggest working out where that friction, because you're going to have some of that friction as you change, and so working out where that is. Getting started is definitely going to be easiest in terms of getting started, and having a baseline secure environment to use those secure environment variables. They will work. They will get you out the door, but they may not be as they may end up being a piece of technical debt. So looking at that and working out how much you're willing to invest in this point in terms of using a kind of very robust solution in Key Vault is something worth looking at. But it's a great question.
So one of the things I'm doing in the background as you speak, Andrew, is actually responding to some of the questions that we posted in the chat. Now, we have way more questions than we have time, technically at time, but we got a couple more minutes. And one of the questions that was asked is, we're starting from a blank sheet. What is essential, not shiny, to start with? Is choosing from what's available from Microsoft. And for me these days, one of the things that I'm a huge fan of is actually Azure Static Web Apps. And it's really nice because it allows you to kind of combine your front end and your back end using functions APIs in order to create your API and do deployments using GitHub Actions, which once again, just from a speed and ease and simplicity standpoint, is a really quick way to get up and running. So if you check out the thread here, there's a link to an actual Learn module, which I highly recommend for anyone that's interested to check out, that kind of walks you through getting your first Azure Static Web App going.
Yeah, I think Azure Static Web Apps is a great technology, especially if you're starting out. And if you're comfortable with that using functions, it's fantastic. It makes it so easy to get started. I've used it a couple of times for projects, and it just makes it a dream. It was funny when it was launched. We took one of the projects that I had built back, I guess it was a year before, and we modernized it with static web apps, and it just made all of the kind of process of build and deploy so much easier. So I think thinking about that is really important. Now, the other thing that I need to suggest is check out on Azure Architecture Center. I can't actually find the question in the chat, so I'm going to ask you, Dee, if you can add this on. There's a link. It's aka.ms/startupstack. Check that one out. We have a bit of architecture recommendation there, which goes through how you might think about that. But I think that you need to think about the core building blocks that you're putting together for your and you want to think about where you're at and where your team's at in terms of levels of comfort. You don't want to throw like, I love Cosmos DB, but getting someone who's very used to relational databases around how to think about a key value store or a document database is potentially a bridge too far when you're really trying to get a product out the door. So it may be better to think about a relational database at that point. Like for many kind of developers of my generation, something like Postgres is like out of the gate a great choice. It is incredibly well supported, incredibly stable. You have Azure database for Postgres flexible servers, which gives you a really nice scalable option to choose there, where you can start out at a relatively cheap SKU and then scale as you need to. And kind of thinking about that across the different building blocks of your stack. Like, how are you running your application? Now, if you're comfortable with functions and you're looking at like a fairly heavy front end kind of static web app style application, then static web apps is a fantastic choice. If it's more of a traditional monolith, where it's like a Rails app or that kind of thing, then thinking about something you can put in a container and seriously looking at either Azure App Service or Azure Container Apps. Those are kind of the decisions you want to be making. Then you want to also think about things like making sure you have good, solid monitoring as part of your architecture. If you're heading towards production, then you want to have that monitoring. So having Azure Monitor as part of your stack from day one is significant in terms of improving your visibility and your observability of your stack, which is important because as you start to head from that explore stage where you're kind of just learning to the expand stage where you're really scaling, you want to know what's on fire and not kind of be throwing darts in the dark to try and debug that. So investing in that. And then also you can kind of make your life easier by putting a CDN tier in front of everything. That's looking at Azure Front Door. The new version of Azure Front Door is really very robust and has come much more into startup land in terms of price as well. So it's a good service to look at. And then one place which I think is like a key thing in every startup stack is like investing in continuous integration and continuous deployment or delivery, depending on which D you prefer, from day one. Like absolutely key, because it is such an investment in being able to iterate faster, because at every stage you want to be able to iterate quickly and get things out the door. And if your deployment, your time from like committing that or the time and effort from committing the change to having the change in the world is like more than an hour, you're in trouble. If you can ratchet that down, so you should be able to do 7 to 8 deploys a day. You should be able to do more than that, because that's the speed that you want, at which you want to be iterating, because that de-risks every change you make. It makes everything much faster and kind of keeps everyone much happier. Those would be my blank slate suggestions, but definitely check out aka.ms/startup stack. We've probably got time for one or two more. We're running long, but we're told we could run like 15 minutes long, and there's a bunch of questions, and we want to get to as many as we can. Do we want to do like a quick fire round, and is there some that we can pick off, D?
Yeah, I'm actually going through and dropping a couple of things in the chat, but one of the quick questions is there a forum to join like-minded individuals to create a startup, each one contributing their technical ability? Well, I think one of the things that I've found that's kind of cool here is YC actually has a startup founder tool, and it allows you to actually list out your skill sets and your interests. So if you're in marketing, you can actually find and partner with someone that's good at, say, the tech and or vice versa. So we'll drop the link for that in a moment. And then the other question that I saw in here that was kind of interesting, tips for startups building open source yet also monetizing. I think that what we've seen there over the last couple of years is a lot of interest in tools like what's the one, the JSON that does blanking on this, but really just people turning things like Docker, open source projects into open source. There's a lot of pathways, and obviously a business model that works. But I would say probably the biggest thing is to go into it with the idea that you're going to start with something that will be picked up by the community, and think about what that price to enterprise or to providing support would look like. There's a couple others in here, but I wanted to see if there was any that came up for you.
There was a really interesting question asking about what the best setup for startups for dev infrastructure, like physical machines with a lot of dev tools, like an Azure VM. Is there an absolute rule? There's not an absolute rule. I'm gonna say that out of the gate. I think a lot of people kind of approach this as like, how do I not spend as much on my devs' laptops? And I think that's kind of a false economy in many ways. That like the cost of that hardware is a fraction of what you're paying your devs' payroll. So like, don't cheap out on that. But like, I think there's some really interesting options that are coming out now in terms of standardizing what your devs have and potentially giving them access to more power than is even reasonable inside a laptop. So looking at VMs, like you said, is really interesting. Now, if you're looking at a Windows environment, then the newly announced Azure Dev Boxes is really interesting. I haven't had a chance to dig into it, but I think that level of standardization is very interesting to kind of get things started. And but I love, if you're more on kind of Linuxy side, then you've got to check out like VS Code just as a baseline. Using dev containers for VS Code is really powerful. So regardless of what environment you're on, that can allow a level of standardization across your stack. So you don't lose days to a new dev having to spin up a stack and kind of put everything together. Like if you have a well set up dev container, it can literally be a matter of minutes because they're just going to pull down the dev container and run. But the next step of that is actually GitHub code spaces, which is very cool because it takes that and then takes it and runs it on a remote VM. And so you could have a 64 core machine there, or a GPU enabled machine if you're doing machine learning, and you can have this huge power and it feels like native VS Code. All of your editor, it kind of sits in front of you and is low latency, but then the build process is running on an outsized, and some of your extensions are running on much more powerful machines. So I think that's a really great one to have a look at. Some other ones that we want to hit. How do you tackle the temptation of adding a not necessary or critical features in the MVP phase of a startup at the same time as avoiding cutting corners so that your architecture is not ruined wrong from the very beginning? And what's your opinion on DDD for the MVP for a startup? Great questions. Is really hard, I think is the answer. Again, finding that balance is really delicate. You don't want to over-index and do too much, but you also need to really make sure you understand, and this is where really understanding what your customers and your users value is very important. And I think there's often this kind of separation between the technology and engineering and the business, and like that's a really toxic breakdown to have, because you want to be intimately involved and intimately understanding what your customers need. And so working out what is and isn't necessary is super important, and also being willing to be wrong on some of those things. I really like DDD conceptually, but I think if you become too dogmatic about it and it gets in the way of progress, you're in trouble. So finding that right level of, yes, you should be thinking about things like, where are your contexts? You should be developing a ubiquitous domain language, but also you need to be flexible in that because you are still understanding your domain. Your domain is less established, and your focus of your business is potentially going to change. Like if you think of a company like Slack, which started out like as a gaming company, like building games, and then is now built a communications powerhouse. That is not a pivot you could ever have anticipated, but it is one that has been wildly successful. And so there's obviously a huge amount of retooling, and I would love to see what like little legacy bits of the old company exist inside Slack still, but you want to minimize that. So don't commit too heavily into that, but also do understand your domain, because it's going to make things a much easier. Okay, D, I'm gonna let you pick the last one and then we're gonna wrap.
All right, last question I will go with is, this is a great one actually. So this is from Michael, looking at Azure App Services and the automatic scaling of those services, would you recommend direct deployment to those resources, or would you focus on a containerization and leveraging Kubernetes be the better route? And the answer to that, and you saw this in our talk, is it depends, and it depends on the knowledge, the skill level, understanding of your team. If you are coming from enterprise or coming from a startup that did Kubernetes and containerization all day, every day, then why not? But what I really would optimize for, especially in the early stage of the startup, is just speed and ease of deployment. You'll get more mileage out of that, and Azure App Services is a perfectly good choice for that. And then you may have heard, we now have actually Azure App Services with containers now in general availability. So no longer do you have to choose between AKS or ACS, but you now have another deployment option that allows you to use the best of app services as well as get the mileage out of containerization. So thanks for that question, Michael. Great question. And thanks you all for the time. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate all of the fantastic questions. Sorry to those that we couldn't get to. A big plug again for for aka.ms/startupstack. It's got a couple of resources on Azure Architecture Center focused just for startups to think about how you architect. A lot of stuff that was covered in the talk and that we've talked about is in that. It's also got some example code and kind of how you might approach this. And then startups.microsoft.com for Microsoft Founders Hub. All the resources you need to get started, whether you are literally a business name and an idea, all the way through to venture-funded scaling startup. There are the resources there for you. Check it out. I have been Andrew Harvey. This has been Damola Omotosho. Thank you so much for being with us, and have a great day wherever you are in the world.